We're starting off this part of the section with acetaldehyde and the characteristics acetaldehyde bring to beer. When acetaldehyde is present in beer, it typically comes across as the aroma and flavor of fresh cut green apples. Sometimes it can bring a hit of grass or a green leaf kind of character, and in higher concentrations, it can come across smelling like latex paint. Now let's take a look at the most common formation of acetaldehyde in beer during fermentation. The primary cause for it during primary fermentation is a result of yeast metabolism. Normally, the yeast produce acetaldehyde during fermentation, but then reduce and converts it to ethanol during the secondary fermentation. However, if the beer gets oxidized in the secondary fermentation process, this can reverse the ethanol conversion and raise the levels of acetaldehyde back to an undesirable amount. Now, the causes of elevated and undesirable levels of acetaldehyde. Typically, green or young beer has noticeable amounts of acetaldehyde. High levels are going to mostly be noticed in the first days or even weeks of beer being taken out of the fermenter and being packaged. It may age out in some cases, but it may not. It's not a guarantee. It can also be present if the beer is removed from the yeast too early. The yeast produce the acetaldehyde first, then convert it to ethanol later in their life cycle. Separating the beer from the yeast before that conversion is able to happen can leave large amounts of acetaldehyde. A bacterial infection can also create acetaldehyde. Specifically, bacteria like Xymomonas and Acetobacter can produce acetaldehyde in beer. It can also be produced when there is an inadequate amount of dissolved oxygen in the wort when we pitch our yeast. This lack of dissolved oxygen stresses the yeast, and in turn, they tend to produce more off flavor and aroma, causing byproducts like acetaldehyde. Now, discussing acetaldehyde in terms of being a flavor flaw. Generally, acetaldehyde is considered an off flavor in most beer styles. Saying in most alludes to an exception, and the study guide does indeed note one. More on that in a second. Its cause is usually from the brewing process, fermentation specifically, or storage process, particularly when it gets oxidized. The exception that's noted in the study guide is Keller beers. In Keller beers, it's acceptable at low levels. Now, I will add at this point, just to make sure all our bases are covered, that the 2021 BJCP style guideline contradicts this. That entry says that there should be no apple-like off flavors. The exam study guide that we're taking our information from was written well before 2021 style guidelines, so this might be an updated take on the style. What I'm trying to say is that you already have a roughly one of those 1 in a million type moments of getting the single specific question on what style are low levels of acetaldehyde appropriate. If Keller beer is one of the choices, my guess would be to pick Keller beer. Acetaldehyde in summary. Acetaldehyde is usually a flaw, but has specific instances where low levels are acceptable. Careful yeast management and oxygen control are essential to avoid undesirable flavors. And if we perceive acetaldehyde in a beer that we are presented in our tasting/judging exam, we will definitely want to make an improvement or fix suggestion along the lines of maintain consistent fermentation and proper storage to prevent oxidation and acetaldehyde reformation. All right, that is it for acetaldehyde. Let's move on to the next lesson.